And then we had a hearing on Monday, and we went to court and we explained to the judge what was going on and how this was all working. And fortunately, the judge was fair and he was kind and he was sympathetic, and he said, you know what? No, you can't stop their sale. Keep it going.
When two people build something from nothing, the story people remember is always about the success. What they don't see is the small fractures that appear long before the structure collapses. The story of Heavy D and Diesel Dave isn't really about the moment everything fell apart in October 2025. That was just the moment everyone else finally saw what had been breaking for years. To understand what really happened between them, you have to go back to where it all started, not at the church singles event in Utah where they met, but at the exact moment success stopped being something they shared and started being something that divided them. Dave Sparks, who would become known as Heavy D, and Dave Kiley, who the world called Diesel Dave, had everything in common when they met. They spoke the same language, the language of diesel engines, mechanical innovation, and the kind of relentless drive that most people would call obsessive. They didn't just like trucks, they lived for them. Their early days in the garage in Woods Cross, Utah, weren't about becoming famous. They were about testing ideas, pushing boundaries, and creating something that had never existed before. That shared vision is what made them dangerous in the best way possible. Together, they didn't ask if something could be done. They asked how fast they could do it and how far they could push it. But here's the thing about partnerships built on shared obsession. They work beautifully until the moment they don't. And that moment usually comes when one person's vision of the future starts diverging from the others. For Heavy D and Diesel Dave, that divergence didn't happen because of ego or betrayal in the traditional sense. It happened because they both wanted to win, but they started defining winning differently. The television show changed everything, though it took years for that change to become visible. When Diesel Brothers premiered on Discovery Channel in January 2016, it transformed two mechanics into public figures overnight. The show ran for 7 seasons, and during that time, Heavy D and Diesel Dave became more than just craftsmen. They became commodities. Their name became a brand. Their reputation became intellectual property. Their image became collateral. And suddenly, the partnership that had been built on creative freedom started operating under entirely different rules. Rules that came from lawyers, network executives, and financial pressures that neither of them had experienced before. The environmental lawsuit filed by Utah physicians for a healthy environment in 2017 was the first real warning sign that success was creating problems they hadn't anticipated. The lawsuit alleged that modifications being made on the show, specifically the practice of disabling emissions controls to achieve what's known as rolling coal, violated federal environmental law. But here's what's crucial to understanding the split between them. This lawsuit didn't affect them equally. It affected them psychologically in completely opposite ways. For Heavy D, the lawsuit represented an external threat to something he had built. His instinct was to fight it, to defend it in court, and to prove that what they were doing wasn't wrong. He became focused on the legal battle, on meeting with lawyers, on understanding the financial exposure. The lawsuit became his problem to solve. For Diesel Dave, the same lawsuit landed differently. It wasn't about fighting back or defending the brand. It was about questioning whether the brand was worth defending in the first place. The difference was subtle but crucial. One man saw a problem to overcome. The other started wondering if the problem was the cost of the path they were on. By 2018, when the federal injunction came down restricting further modifications that violated the Clean Air Act, the damage to their partnership had already begun internally. They were still appearing together on television. They were still presenting themselves as a unified team. But behind the scenes, they were having two completely different conversations about what came next. Heavy D was calculating how to adapt to the legal restrictions while maintaining the brand's profitability. Diesel Dave was starting to question whether profitability mattered, if it meant continuing to do something he was no longer sure about. The financial penalties that accumulated over the following years, over $800,000 in federal and county payments, nearly $1 million in legal fees, put enormous strain on both of them, but in different ways. Heavy D was consumed by the business problem. How do we manage these costs? How do we keep the empire functioning? How do we maintain the revenue streams that support everything? Diesel Dave was consumed by a different question. Why are we fighting so hard to keep something that's costing us everything? Then came the trademark lawsuit from Diesel SPA, the Italian clothing company. This was different from the environmental case. This wasn't about what they had done. It was about what they were called. The lawsuit alleged that using diesel in their merchandise brand created confusion and infringed on the Italian company's established trademark. It escalated into a full federal trial, and by 2023, the judgment came down, $11.8 million in damages. Even after a judge reduced the original claim of $59 million by roughly 80%, the number was devastating. It wasn't just money. It represented the idea that the very name that had made them famous might not actually belong to them. This is when the real split between them became impossible to hide. The trademark case exposed something that had been growing in the background. They had fundamentally different beliefs about what their brand meant. For Heavy D, the brand was something to be defended, protected, and monetized. It was an asset. It was intellectual property. It was worth fighting for in court. For Diesel Dave, the brand had become something else entirely, a weight that kept pulling them in directions they didn't want to go. By October 2025, when Heavy D announced the liquidation of assets, the break between them was already complete. The garage sale, the liquidation of millions of dollars in custom-built trucks and equipment, wasn't a business pivot. It was a survival move. A federal judge had already stepped in and halted parts of the sale, concerned about asset movement during active enforcement of financial penalties. This wasn't two partners making strategic decisions together. This was one man trying to navigate a financial and legal crisis, while the other man had already stepped back from the entire enterprise. Then came October 7, 2025. U.S. Marshals arrested Heavy D for contempt of court, tied to failure to comply with financial penalties totaling $843,602.23. In that moment, the partnership became officially irreversibly over, not because they fought or betrayed each other, but because one man was facing federal enforcement while the other had already quietly exited the battlefield. Diesel Dave's silence after the arrest wasn't indifference. It was distance. It was the silence of someone who had already made the difficult choice to let go. What really happened between them wasn't a dramatic betrayal or a public falling out. It was a slow divergence in values that got masked by television cameras and marketing until the legal system forced it into the light. Heavy D became someone who was willing to fight through consequences to preserve what they had built. Diesel Dave became someone who realized that fighting had a price that was too high to pay. One man doubled down. The other walked away. The fact that their original television show ended in 2023, not because of cancellation, but by mutual agreement to leave Discovery Channel and move to YouTube independence, now reads like a carefully choreographed exit. It wasn't Heavy D versus Diesel Dave at that moment. The split had already happened structurally, internally, in their fundamental beliefs about what came next. The announcement to leave television was the public acknowledgement of something that had been privately true for much longer. The most revealing detail in all of this is what happened after the legal collapse. Heavy D, still managing the aftermath of financial penalties and legal pressure, made a shocking pivot into the hydrogen and electric vehicle space. He acquired rights connected to the canceled Nikola Badger project in February 2024 and began building EMBBR Motors, a venture focused on zero-emission vehicle development. This is the move that reveals his true character after everything fell apart. The man once famous for diesel smoke and rolling coal was now trying to build clean energy solutions. This wasn't a business decision made in a boardroom. This was a philosophical repositioning. Heavy D, facing the consequences of everything the partnership had created, made the only choice he could live with: transformation. If the legal system was going to force him to stop building diesel culture, he would build something else instead. If the name Diesel was going to cost him $11.8 million, he would find a name that belonged only to him. If the partnership with Diesel Dave had become toxic, he would create a new identity that didn't require it. Meanwhile, Diesel Dave continued driving the Brodozer into 2026, still powered by the Cat C13 engine, still performing at Monster Jam events, still tied to the diesel performance culture that defined their rise. He stayed in the lane they had built together while Heavy D abandoned it entirely. This divergence is the clearest evidence of what really happened between them. They fundamentally disagreed about whether the culture they had created was worth the price it was demanding. The divorce that followed 5 months later, Ashley Sparks filing for divorce on March 10, 2026, wasn't the cause of the partnership's collapse. It was a symptom of it. The personal structure was breaking because the professional structure had already broken. The timing was devastating not because the events happened in a line, but because they happened simultaneously. Federal enforcement, financial penalties, trademark judgments, liquidation, arrest, silence, divorce, and transformation all compressed into a few months, where each consequence fed into the next. What Heavy D would reveal about what really happened between him and Diesel Dave, if he were fully honest, is that they were never really separated by conflict. They were separated by the answer to a single question. Do we keep fighting for what we built, or do we accept that what we built has a cost we're no longer willing to pay? Heavy D fought. Diesel Dave accepted. And that simple difference in answer created an unbridgeable gap between two men who once seemed inseparable. The empire didn't collapse because they were enemies. It collapsed because they were partners, and partners require alignment. Once alignment disappeared, there was nothing left to hold the structure together except legal obligations and financial consequences. The cameras stopped rolling. The shared appearances ended. The unified front dissolved. And two men who had once shared a dream found themselves on completely opposite sides of the wreckage, each dealing with the aftermath in the only way they knew how. The real story of what happened between Heavy D and Diesel Dave isn't about a dramatic betrayal. It's about how success can slowly calcify a partnership until the moment comes when two people who built something together realize they can't rebuild it together. It's about how pressure doesn't just break things. It reveals which things were actually worth keeping and which things were always going to break under weight. And it's about how sometimes, when everything falls apart, the only way forward is to become something completely different than what you were before. Like, subscribe, and follow for more.